Imagine this for a second. What if a huge chunk of history, especially Russian history as we know it, isn't actually real? What if it's like a massive fabrication designed to hide something completely different?
That's a pretty wild thought to start with, isn't it?
It really is. And that's the core idea behind the sources we're exploring today. We're diving deep into the issue with baptism of Russia. It's by Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovskiy, part of their bigger series, History, Fiction, or Science.
Right, the new Chronology series.
Exactly. So our mission here is to unpack these really, really bold claims. They basically say that standard timeline, what they call Scaligerian chronology, is just a total mess, basically made up in the 16th century.
Yeah.
And that, well, almost everything in it is blatantly untrue.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge to accepted history. But what's interesting is they don't just, wave their hands. They claim they have irrefutable evidence, mathematical, statistical, astronomical stuff. So most of us, you probably included, have learned history based on that classical timeline. But after this deep dive, you might start looking at things a bit more critically.
Okay, let's get into that core claim then. The official baptism of Russia. Usually we hear Prince Vladimir around 986 to 989 AD.
Yep, that's the standard story, often from the Povest Reminilet, that chronicle.
But that chronicle itself is from the 18th century, right? These sources say, hold on, earlier church writings tell a different story.
Exactly. They look at the Great Catechesis, which was published in Moscow, 1627, so earlier.
And what does it say?
Well, crucially, it talks about 4 baptisms of Russia, not just one.
4. Okay, like what?
It details the first one by Apostle Andrew himself, then a second by Patriarch Photius back when Rurik was ruling.
Rurik, the sort of legendary founder.
Right. And then a third under Princess Olga around 955 AD.
Huh. And the 4th would be Vladimir's.
Presumably, but the catechesis is weirdly specific and also vague. It gives no dates for the first 2, and the dates for Olga's baptism are apparently inconsistent within the text itself.
So it already muddies the water compared to the simple Vladimir did it in 988 story.
Precisely. And the new chronology argument is that this whole familiar Romanovian version of history, including that Povest Reminilet chronicle, was put together much, much later, think 17th, 18th centuries.
So they're saying the story was kind of backfilled.
That's the idea, that the truth about the baptism was only discovered by later historians, Bayer, Miller, Schlexer, those guys, because the chronicle we use today just didn't exist in that form back in the early 1600s.
It suggests a deliberate construction project almost.
That's the claim.
Okay, this leads to something really wild they propose. A 500-year chronological error. How does that work?
Well, it hinges on Old Slavic script. They point to 2 letters, which stood for 400, and a teeth, which stood for 900.
Okay.
And they argue these letters looked incredibly similar, virtually indistinguishable, in many old texts.
I see where this is going.
Yep. If someone misread a tire as a reader when copying a date, boom, you've just accidentally added 500 years.
So apply that to the baptism date. If the original was, say, 6497 since Adam, using the ADOPN for 400.
Right, but it gets misread as 690-97 with for 900.
The date jumps forward 500 years. So instead of the 10th century, it lands somewhere in
the late 15th century, roughly 1489 AD by our calendar.
Wow. And does that 15th century date connect to anything?
They argue it connects perfectly. It lines up with the end of the 15th century, a time of major reform in the Russian church and things like the Council of Florence. It makes the baptism part of that era's events, not some distant 10th century affair.
So if the event moves, what about the people involved?
Good question. The new chronology goes there too. They suggest key figures usually placed in the 10th century actually belong in the 15th.
Like who?
Okay, so Nicola Crucifer. They identify him with Nicholas of Cusa, the famous German cardinal who lived 1401-1464.
That's a huge shift.
Totally. Sicinius. They link him to Metropolitan Zosima, who died around 1478 or maybe 1489. And Sergei, Archbishop of Novgorod.
Let me guess, someone from the 15th century.
Sergei the Rodinus, the really famous Russian saint. He was canonized in 1452.
So if these major players are actually 15th century figures, I mean, that changes everything about them in the events, doesn't it?
It fundamentally rewrites the context. It asks, were these figures duplicated or were the events simply misdated? Either way, it's a radical revision.
And for you listening, this isn't just academic juggling. Think about it. Shifting these dates rearranges the entire narrative of how a nation, how Russia came to be. It changes the origin story itself. Okay, so if timelines are potentially shifted by centuries, what does that mean for the physical stuff, the documents, the artifacts?
Right. Well, the sources claim there was a huge deliberate effort to fake ancient Russian documents, a global falsification, they call it.
When?
During the time of the first Romanov Tsars, starting around the mid-17th century.
And how do they argue this? What's the evidence?
A key thing is handwriting. They claim that all these supposedly ancient texts, though allegedly from before the Romanovs, are actually perfectly readable and look exactly like handwriting from the late 17th century.
Suspiciously consistent, you mean?
Exactly. Suggesting they're not originals, but mass-produced copies made much later.
And how does that compare to known, genuine documents from the early Romanov period?
They contrast it with documents known to be from, say, 1613, 1614. Those, they say, are really hard to read, require much effort because the letters have weird, idiosyncratic shapes.
So the real early stuff looks different, but the stuff claimed to be even older looks like later writing.
That's the core of their argument about the handwriting, yeah. It implies the ancient documents are actually 17th century creations.
Do they have other examples beyond handwriting style?
Oh, yeah. They mention old Russian coins with inscriptions that nobody can really read properly, often dismissed as Arabic because they look kind of swirly. But Fomenko and Nosovskiy argue these are actually old Russian letters from maybe the 14th to 16th centuries, a script that's just been completely forgotten.
Suggesting a lost part of their own written history.
Possibly. And they get very specific with some examples, like a royal decree supposedly from Ivan the Terrible.
The famous one.
Yeah. They include a photo where the big royal seal isn't attached directly to the document. It's on a separate little piece of paper that's just been glued on.
Glued on. That sounds clumsy. Like a forgery.
Well, that's certainly what they imply. Obviously, counterfeited is their phrase.
Any other artifacts?
Yes. They discuss a portrait. Supposedly, it's Ivan the Terrible in the Alexandrovskaya Sloboda Museum. They claim the label Ivan Vasilievich is clearly painted over something else, maybe Khan Simeon, they speculate.
Painted over.
Yeah. And get this. The face in the portrait looks strikingly similar to another portrait, one that's supposed to be Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich Romanov.
Wait, so they think they just reused a portrait and relabeled it?
That's the suggestion. A recycled portrait to perhaps create or bolster the image of an earlier ruler.
Okay, so pasted seals, maybe reused portraits. What about security features on documents? You'd expect something to prevent forgeries, right?
Absolutely. And that brings us to tugras. You know those really complex, ornate calligraphic signatures or seals? Almost impossible to fake.
Yeah, you see them on Ottoman documents, for example.
Exactly. They were common anti-forgery measures. You see them on 17th century Ottoman Sultan documents. Danish, Swedish, Brandenburg, Hamburg monarchs used them. Even the early Romanovs themselves, like Mikhail and Peter the Great, used tugras.
Okay, so where's the problem?
The problem, according to the sources, is the absence of these complex tugras on the documents supposedly from before the Romanovs, like the alleged originals from Ivan III or Vasily III.
They don't have.
Apparently not. The new chronology interpretation is that when the Romanovs were supposedly mass-producing these counterfeit originals of earlier documents, they couldn't replicate the tugras. The specialized skill was lost, or maybe never existed in that earlier period as depicted. So they used simply seals, which were much easier to fake.
Wow. So the lack of a security feature becomes evidence of forgery in their view.
Precisely. It paints a picture of a systematic effort to create a historical paper trail, but maybe without the authenticating details of the time.
This really does make you look twice at historical documents, doesn't it? It highlights how even physical objects can be part of constructing a particular story. So, if the conventional story of Russian history, the documents, the timeline are all potentially suspect, what do these sources propose as the real story?
Okay, this is where it gets even more radical. They propose a vast single empire, which they call the Great Mongolian Empire.
Great equals Mongolian. What does that mean?
It's their term for a huge empire they believe existed right up until the early 17th century. And crucially, they argue the Russian Tsar, or Khan, as they sometimes call him, was the supreme ruler of this empire.
The supreme ruler. Over what?
Over a vast domain that they claim included Western Europe. They point to instances where 16th century Western European monarchs apparently addressed the Russian Tsar as Great Emperor.
Really? How does mainstream history explain that?
Usually it's dismissed as, confusion, maybe flattery, or even mockery, just incorrect use of titles.
But the new chronology says,
They take it literally. They argue it genuinely reflected the Russian Tsar's superior rank within this massive interconnected empire. They even quote Dmitry Ivanovich, the one usually called the false Dmitry or the imposter. He apparently said something like, "I am not merely a prince, a czar, and a liege. I am the great emperor of my vast domain. Am I not addressed as emperor by every European monarch?"
so they see that not as boasting, but as a statement of fact within their proposed imperial structure.
Exactly, a reflection of a lost reality.
Okay, a Russian-led empire, including Western Europe. That completely flips the script. What else does this alternative vision entail?
Well, geographically, they make a fascinating claim about Russia's capital. They argue that Alexandrovskaya Sloboda,
That's near Moscow, right? Modern Alexandria?
yes, in the Vladimir Oblast, they claim that was the actual capital of Russia for about 20 years, starting around 1563 with Ivan the Terrible's Oprichnina.
Before the Moscow Kremlin became the main center.
That's their assertion. They describe Alexandrovskaya Sloboda not as some temporary retreat, but as a full-blown capital. Luxurious palace, state departments like the Oprichnina Duma, diplomatic offices, a printing press, bell casting. The works.
A major center.
A major center. And they add another layer. They point out that some foreign envoys apparently referred to Ivan the Terrible as Pharaoh.
Pharaoh. Like the Egyptian rulers.
Yeah. And they speculate, this is really out there, that maybe the famous biblical Egyptian Alexandria and its legendary library might actually be distorted memories of Alexandrovskaya Sloboda and its library, which they claim was destroyed by the Romanovs during the time of troubles, or the Great Strife, as they call it.
Whoa. Connecting ancient Egypt to 16th century Russia.
It's a consistent theme in their work, finding these echoes, these parallels between biblical stories and events they place in medieval Russian history.
That's quite a connection. Do they offer other evidence for this link between biblical ancient figures and Russian history?
They do. They point to art, specifically 16th century frescoes. There are examples in the Pokrovskaya Church at Alexandrovskaya Sloboda and also in the Blagoveshchensky Cathedral right inside the Moscow Kremlin.
What do these frescoes show?
Amazingly, they seem to depict biblical figures, Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, King David, right alongside Russian princes like Vladimir, Boris, Gleb, Daniil Alexandrovich, and not just alongside, but as part of a single, unified genealogical tree, as if they were all contemporaries or part of the same historical lineage.
Seriously, biblical figures and Russian princes in the same family tree.
That's what the frescoes apparently show. And the authors argue this isn't just symbolic art. They say it reflects the political reality of Moscow as the Third Rome.
The Third Rome concept.
Right, but for them, it wasn't just a theory or an aspiration. They claim it was the actual state of affairs within their proposed great Mongolian Empire, where Russian history and biblical history were seen as intertwined, part of the same imperial story.
So this isn't just redating Russia, it's pulling all these ancient civilizations into one massive, relatively recent imperial narrative centered on Russia.
That's the essence of it. It challenges the whole idea of separate ancient histories developing independently. For you listening, it presents a completely different map of the past.
Okay, so if this massive falsification happened in the 17th century, did any hint of the older true story survive? Did anyone push back?
According to the sources, yes. They argue that traces persisted and there was resistance. They highlight a figure named Pyotr Nikiforov Krekshin.
Who was he?
A government official, pretty prominent during Peter the Great's time, lived 1684 to 1763. And apparently, in 1762, he wrote a critique of a new history book that followed the standard Scaligerian timeline.
And what did Krekshin argue?
He argued completely against it. He claimed that the Romans were always being beaten by the Slavs, or Russians. He basically equated Slavs with all sorts of ancient groups: Scythians, Sarmatians, Goths, Vandals, Varangians.
Wow, quite a list.
And get this, he portrayed Attila the Hun and Prince Vladimir as living at the same time as contemporaries, totally defying the accepted chronology.
So even in the 18th century, someone prominent was arguing for a radically different timeline, similar to the new chronology.
Exactly. And the authors stress that Krekshin's views weren't just some personal eccentricity. They claim his views corresponded to the general level of knowledge in that epoch and were generally shared by the educated part of the Russian society until the late 18th century.
Implying that the standard history we know had to be actively imposed.
That's the argument. That the Malarian and Scaligerian version, pushed by historians like Gerhard Müller, only won out after much effort, and involved ruthlessly suppressing this older, dominant understanding. Mainstream history, of course, sees it differently as establishing scholarly rigor, but this source presents it as suppression.
That certainly gives context to the famous disputes, like the one involving Lomonosov, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Mikhail Lomonosov, the great Russian scientist and writer. The sources emphasize his fierce opposition to those German historians Miller, Bayer, Schlesser in the mid-18th century. He flat out accused Miller of falsifying Russian history.
And didn't something happen to Lomonosov's own history book?
Yes, that's another key point they raise. Lomonosov wrote The Ancient History of Russia. But after he died, the version that got published, well, they claim it was tampered with.
Tampered with how?
They claim to have used a linguistic analysis method. They call it an authorial invariant method, which looks at the frequency of common function words.
Like the and is.
Exactly, kind of a stylistic fingerprint. And based on this, they argue the published version of Lomonosov's history is a forgery, likely rewritten by his opponent, Miller.
Rewritten by the very person he accused of falsification. That's quite the claim.
It is. It paints a picture of intense academic and political struggle over Russia's historical narrative.
It seems like there are quite a few threads that don't quite fit the standard narrative.
Yeah.
What else do they point to?
Well, remember, Krekshin and Lomonosov placing Attila and Vladimir closer together. They point out that some medieval German sagas, like the Saga of Tidrek, also depict Attila the Hun and a Prince Vladimir figure as contemporaries.
Really, old sagas matching the controversial timeline.
That's what they claim. It aligns perfectly with their compressed timeline, which contradicts the usual 5-century gap between Attila and the traditional Vladimir. They ask, why would these old stories match our pseudoscience if it wasn't reflecting some reality?
Interesting point. Any other anomalies?
Yes, another fascinating one involves medieval France. They claim that French kings used to swear their coronation oath on a holy book written in Church Slavonic.
French kings swearing on a Slavonic text. Why?
The book is known as the Rhemish Fragments, or Rheims Gospel. The new chronology interpretation is that this points to Church Slavonic being a major, perhaps the imperial language, used across their proposed great Mongolian Empire, even in Western Europe.
An imperial language, huh? What about cultural practices?
They draw a parallel between the Russian tirum, the secluded women's quarters in old Russian palaces, and the concept of the Oriental harem. They argue they're basically two names for the same custom of female seclusion, suggesting shared cultural roots within this larger empire.
Theorem and harem.
Related. That's their suggestion. They note the last royal harem palace was built in the Moscow Kremlin quite late, 1635-1636. And Peter the Great, who campaigned hard against these ancient Russian customs, was ironically born in a harem palace himself.
It's like these older customs lingered longer than we think.
Exactly. And they throw in other bits, like an old map from 1544 that apparently shows the Kosaki Orda, Cossack horde, and labels the northern Caucasus region as Albania. Just more details that don't quite fit the standard map.
And you mentioned religious sects earlier.
Right. They bring up groups like the Sabotniki. This sect apparently believed that the biblical places Assyria, Egypt, Babylon were actually symbolic names for medieval Russia. They even called Russia Ashur.
Identifying Russia with ancient biblical lands?
Yes. And another group, the Doukhobori, who had links to a 16th century Russian Judaic movement, traced their own spiritual traditions back to biblical figures who were contemporary with King Nebuchadnezzar.
Okay. And how does the new chronology connect Nebuchadnezzar?
They identify Nebuchadnezzar with Ivan the Terrible.
Ivan the Terrible is Nebuchadnezzar.
In their framework, yes. So these sects, preserving traditions, linking Russian figures or Russia itself to biblical times, are seen as echoes of that unified history proposed by the new chronology.
So for you listening, all these examples, the historians, the sagas, the language, the customs, the maps, the sects, are presented as lingering evidence of a very different Russian identity and global position, one that was suppressed but never entirely erased. Let's shift gears a bit. What about more tangible things, like buildings, architecture, art? Does the new chronology find evidence there too?
Oh, absolutely. They argue that even the look of typical Russian churches has been misrepresented.
How so? We think of onion domes, cubic shapes.
Right, but they claim that's mostly a 17th century development. Before that, in the 15th and 16th centuries, they argue Russian churches were often built in a style we'd recognize as Gothic.
Gothic, like Western European cathedrals.
Exactly. They describe elongated buildings with hall gable roofs, much more like, say, German or French cathedrals than the later Russian style.
So where did all these supposed Gothic Russian churches go?
Well, the new chronology view is stark. The Romanovs either systematically rebuilt them in the new cubic style or just demolished them entirely.
Why? To erase the past?
To erase the old imperial style of the great Mongolian Empire, they argue. They even make linguistic links. The word dom, used for big cathedrals in Western Europe, they say, comes from the Russian word for house.
Dom, like house.
And Gothic itself. They connect it to Goth, which they claim was an ancient synonym for Cossack.
So Gothic architecture was actually Cossack architecture, brought west by imperial troops.
That's the provocative idea, that this style originated within the empire and spread outwards, only to be later erased in its homeland and rebranded in the West.
Okay, Gothic churches in Russia. That's unexpected. What about music? Any surprises there?
Yes, and this one might really surprise you. The organ.
The pipe organ, the quintessential sound of Western European cathedral.
That's the one. The sources claim organs were actually widespread and popular in 15th and 16th century Russia.
Organs were common in Russia back then.
That's their claim. And they argue that organs were only banned later, maybe by Peter the Great or even earlier Romanovs, as part of that same campaign against ancient Russian customs.
Wow. Is there any evidence for organs being common?
They sent an interesting anecdote. An Italian singer, Filippo Latri, visited Moscow in the late 17th century when he was a teenager. He reported finding organs of an original construction hidden away in wardrobes in many Moscow homes.
Hidden because they were banned.
Exactly. And they also mention a big celebration in Moscow in 1697 that apparently featured 27 organs playing.
27 organs. That suggests they were definitely around.
It does. And more recent archival research, they say, backs this up, showing a much more vibrant musical scene in Russia with large symphony orchestras much earlier than usually thought, like 70 years earlier.
So the cultures might have been much more musically intertwined.
That's the implication. They also note Western European cities were still exporting organs to Russia in the early 18th century, suggesting the demand hadn't completely died out. And as a final thought, they suggest the Russian accordion or harmonium might be a kind of portable, simplified descendant of the organ. They even link the instrument's name to the Russian word garny, meaning good or beautiful.
Interesting connection. So for you listening, these details about architecture and music paint a picture, don't they? A potentially very different cultural landscape in medieval Russia than the one usually presented. Much more connected, maybe, and with elements that were later deliberately changed or hidden.
Well, we have covered a lot of ground here. We've taken a really deep dive into some, frankly, mind-bending ideas from the issue with baptism of Russia and the wider new chronology. We've talked about rewritten timelines, multiple baptisms, maybe forged documents, a whole different vision of a great Mongolian empire.
Right, with Russia at the center, potentially ruling over Europe. Gothic architecture in Russia, a hidden history of organ music. It's a lot to take in. It definitely forces you to think about how historical stories get told and maybe how fragile they can be.
Absolutely. And, it's crucial to state again that these ideas are, well, universally rejected by mainstream scholars. They're often labeled pseudoscience.
Right, that's the standard view.
But the authors, Fomenko and Nosovskiy, they stand by their work. They insist it's based on solid scientific data, particularly mathematics, statistics, astronomy. And they explicitly invite people to test their claims empirically. They want more radiocarbon dating, more analysis of astronomical records mentioned in old texts.
So they're putting it out there for scientific challenge.
They are, and regardless of whether you buy their conclusions or not, it raises a really important question for all of us, doesn't it? In today's world, with so much information flying around, how do we, just as individuals, critically evaluate what's presented to us as history? Where do we draw the line between established fact, interpretation, and maybe even deliberate misinformation?
That's the key takeaway, really. For you, the curious learner, this deep dive wasn't about saying Fomenko is right or Fomenko is wrong. It's more about fostering that critical attitude, understanding that history isn't always a fixed thing, that it's constructed, and appreciating that sometimes when you dig into unusual sources, you find surprising facts or perspectives, even if you don't accept the whole theory. So here's a final thought to leave you with. Considering everything we've discussed, the claims about rewriting history, suppressing inconvenient facts, finding echoes in unexpected places, what other historical narratives, ones we generally accept without question, might also contain their own hidden layers, their own phantom reflections maybe? Could other parts of history be waiting for their own individual chronological revolution in enough people's minds? Something to ponder.